I can't even read." The words echoed through the cramped classroom like a slap, sharp and merciless. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the kind of cruel certainty that could crush a 12-year-old's spirit in seconds. Her manicured finger pointed directly at Marcus Thompson, who stood frozen at the blackboard, chalk dust on his worn sneakers and shame burning in his dark eyes. The equation she had written seemed to mock him too, a complex algebraic expression that looked more like a foreign language than mathematics. Around him, 28 pairs of eyes watched with a mixture of pity and relief that they weren't the ones being humiliated. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an electrical hum that seemed to amplify the silence that followed her verbal assault. You know that moment when everything changes, when a single sentence rewrites someone's entire story. That's exactly what happened on this cold Tuesday morning in Detroit, Michigan, inside Roosevelt Elementary School. But what Mrs. Henderson didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that she had just challenged the wrong kid. Because sometimes the most brilliant minds hide behind the most unlikely circumstances, waiting for that one moment to prove the world wrong. Marcus had learned long ago to make himself invisible in this classroom. His second-hand jeans were a size too big, held up by a belt with holes punched by his own hands. His t-shirt, once white, now carried the faint grey tinge of being washed too many times with whatever cheap detergent his grandmother could afford. His backpack was held together with duct tape, and his notebook paper came from the free supplies bin that the school reluctantly provided for students like him. But behind those guarded eyes lived a mind that processed numbers like poetry, that saw patterns where others saw chaos, that could solve problems faster than most adults could even understand them. The other kids in his class came from the nicer part of town, with their brand-name clothes and lunchboxes filled with homemade sandwiches and fresh fruit. Detroit's East Side had been Marcus's whole world for all 12 years of his life, the neighborhood where broken streetlights created pockets of darkness, even in broad daylight, where abandoned houses stood like tombstones to better times, where the sound of sirens was as common as birdsong. His grandmother, Ruby Thompson, worked double shifts at the hospital as a cleaning lady, her arthritis-swollen hands scrubbing floors until past midnight, just to keep their tiny apartment. She would come home exhausted, her uniform stained with the evidence of her labor, but she always asked about his day, always helped him with homework at the kitchen table under their single working lamp. Marcus had never met his father, and his mother had disappeared into the grip of addiction when he was 7, leaving behind only a faint memory of someone who used to sing him lullabies. The morning had started like any other in the Thompson household. Marcus woke up to the sound of his grandmother's alarm clock at 5:30, the same tinny beeping that marked the beginning of her workday. She was already moving around their small kitchen, making coffee in a pot that had seen better decades, and preparing the simple breakfast they shared each morning, generic cereal with milk that was stretched to last the week. Ruby would pack his lunch in a brown paper bag that they reused until it fell apart, usually a peanut butter sandwich and whatever piece of fruit they could afford. She would smooth down his hair with her weathered hand and remind him that education was the only way out, the only path to a life different from the one they were living. Marcus would nod solemnly, understanding even at his young age that her sacrifices were building a bridge to his future. At Roosevelt Elementary, Marcus existed in the spaces between attention. He sat in the back row, completed his assignments without complaint, and rarely raised his hand despite knowing most of the answers. His teachers had categorized him early on, poor kid, probably not college material, likely to follow the same path as so many others from his neighborhood. They saw his threadbare clothes and absent parents and made assumptions about his capabilities. Mrs. Henderson in particular seemed to take a special kind of satisfaction in highlighting his shortcomings, as if proving that poverty and academic success were mutually exclusive. She would call on him when she was certain he didn't know the answer, using his struggles as object lessons for the rest of the class. Her teaching philosophy seemed rooted in the belief that some children were simply destined for mediocrity. But numbers had always spoken to Marcus in a language more clear than English, more honest than the words adults used to describe his circumstances. While other kids struggled with basic multiplication, he was mentally calculating percentages and working through algebraic concepts he'd taught himself from library books. During lunch periods, when other students played outside, Marcus would sit in the corner of the library, devouring math textbooks that were meant for high school students. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Foster, had noticed his hunger for learning and quietly slipped him more advanced books, creating a secret curriculum that fed his mathematical genius. She never made a big deal of it, never drew attention to his exceptional abilities, but she made sure he had access to the knowledge his mind craved. The equation on the board that Tuesday morning was meant to be impossible for a sixth-grade student. Mrs. Henderson had written it as an example of what they would eventually learn in high school, using it to transition into a lesson about basic algebra. The expression involved multiple variables, exponents, and complex operations that required years of mathematical foundation to understand. She had no intention of actually expecting anyone to solve it. It was merely a demonstration of how much they still had to learn. But as she turned back to face the class, her eyes landed on Marcus, and something in his posture, the way he was staring intently at the board, seemed to irritate her. It was as if his concentration itself was a form of defiance, a challenge to her authority and expertise. "Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through the classroom chatter like a blade. The other students turned to look, sensing the shift in atmosphere that always preceded one of her public humiliations. Marcus felt his stomach drop, knowing instinctively that he was about to become the day's cautionary tale. She pointed to the equation with her red pen, the same pen she used to mark his papers with corrections that seemed more vindictive than educational. The numbers and letters seemed to shimmer on the board, not with difficulty but with possibility. He could see the solution as clearly as he could see the worn linoleum beneath his feet, could trace the logical steps in his mind faster than she could probably work through them on paper. But experience had taught him that being right was often more dangerous than being wrong. "Since you seem so fascinated by this equation, why don't you come up here and show us all how much you know?" Her words dripped with sarcasm, and several students snickered in anticipation of the entertainment to come. Marcus felt every eye in the room focus on him as he slowly stood up from his desk. His legs felt unsteady, not from fear of the mathematics, but from the weight of expectation. The expectation that he would fail, that he would prove once again that kids like him weren't capable of academic excellence. The walk to the front of the classroom felt endless, each step echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over his classmates. "Mrs. Henderson stood beside the board with her arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she prepared to deliver another lesson in humiliation. As Marcus approached the blackboard, he could feel the familiar knot forming in his stomach. It was the same feeling he got when his grandmother counted out change at the grocery store, hoping there would be enough for milk and bread. The same feeling when other kids talked about their weekend plans at places his family could never afford to go. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't being asked to pretend to be someone he wasn't or apologize for circumstances beyond his control. This time, he was being asked to do the one thing he was genuinely better at than anyone else in the room. The equation stared back at him from the board, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt a spark of something he had almost forgotten: confidence. Not the fake bravado that some kids his age wore like armor, but the quiet certainty that comes from genuine knowledge. Mrs. Henderson handed him the chalk with an exaggerated gesture of ceremony, playing to her audience of young faces that watched with the morbid curiosity of children witnessing a car crash. She stepped back with her arms still crossed, ready to deliver the killing blow when he inevitably stumbled. The chalk felt small and fragile in Marcus's hand, worn down from countless lessons and explanations that had never included him as anything more than a cautionary example. Behind him, he could hear whispers and shifting in seats as his classmates prepared for the show. But as Marcus looked at the equation, really looked at it, something shifted in his mind. The numbers began to dance, to reveal their relationships and secrets, to offer him a path forward that was as clear as morning sunlight streaming through their apartment's single clean window. The moment stretched out like a held breath. Mrs. Henderson's smile grew wider as the silence extended, interpreting Marcus's pause as confirmation of her assumptions about his abilities. She was already formulating her next comment, the final humiliation that would send him back to his seat with his head down and his confidence shattered. The other students sensed the climax approaching, some leaning forward in anticipation, while others looked away in second-hand embarrassment. But Marcus wasn't paralyzed by fear or confusion. He was simply processing, his remarkable mind working through calculations and logical steps with the kind of speed and precision that would have stunned his teacher if she had bothered to recognize it. What happened next would change everything, not just for Marcus but for every person in that classroom who witnessed it. The chalk trembled slightly in Marcus's grip, not from fear, but from the surge of energy that always accompanied his mathematical breakthroughs. Standing there in front of his classmates, he felt the familiar disconnect between what the world saw and what he truly was. They saw a poor kid in second-hand clothes who probably couldn't spell his own name correctly. What they couldn't see was the mind that had been solving complex problems since he was 8 years old, teaching himself calculus concepts from library books while other kids played video games. The equation on the board wasn't intimidating, it was inviting, like an old friend offering to dance. Mrs. Henderson's smirk grew wider as she watched him hesitate, mistaking his mental preparation for panic. She had no idea she was about to witness something extraordinary, something that would haunt her assumptions for years to come. Marcus's mind drifted back to a night 3 years ago when everything had changed. He was 9 then, sitting at their wobbly kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light, struggling with a homework assignment that seemed impossibly difficult. His grandmother Ruby was washing dishes in their tiny sink, her back bent with exhaustion from another 16-hour day at the hospital. She had been trying to help him with his math homework, but her own education had ended in 8th grade, when her family needed her to work in the cotton fields of rural Alabama. Marcus remembered the frustration in her voice as she admitted she couldn't help him anymore, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of feeling inadequate. That night, something inside him had broken and rebuilt itself stronger, a determination to never let his grandmother feel that helplessness again, to become smart enough to solve any problem that came their way. The memory shifted to the following morning, when Marcus had walked to the Detroit Public Library, a massive brick building that had somehow survived the economic collapse that had claimed so many other institutions in their neighborhood. Mrs. Foster, the head librarian, had watched with curious eyes as this small boy wandered through the mathematics section, pulling books meant for high school and college students. When she asked if he needed help finding something more age-appropriate, Marcus had looked up at her with those serious dark eyes and said he wanted to learn everything about numbers. Something in his voice, a quality of desperate hunger that she recognized from her 40 years of working with young minds, had convinced her to take a chance. She became his unofficial tutor, staying after hours to help him work through concepts that would challenge graduate students, amazed by his ability to grasp abstract mathematical principles with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. Those afternoons in the library became Marcus's sanctuary, the only place where his mind could run free without judgment or limitation. Mrs. Foster would bring him increasingly complex problems, watching in wonder as he developed his own methods for solving equations that textbooks claimed required years of foundation. She taught him about mathematical proofs, about elegant solutions that revealed the hidden beauty in numbers, about great mathematicians throughout history who had changed the world with their discoveries. Marcus absorbed it all with the desperate intensity of someone drowning who had finally found air. He learned about Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician who grew up in poverty, but whose intuitive understanding of numbers revolutionized the field. He studied the work of Emmy Noether, who faced discrimination but persisted in her mathematical pursuits despite the obstacles society placed in her path. But the gap between his private world of mathematical brilliance and his public reality as a struggling student continued to widen with each passing day. At school, Marcus had learned to hide his abilities, to pretend that simple arithmetic was challenging, to avoid drawing attention that might reveal the extent of his knowledge. His teachers, including Mrs. Henderson, had already decided his fate based on his zip code and his grandmother's occupation. They saw his worn clothes and assumed a worn mind, never bothering to look deeper or question their own biases. Marcus had tried once in 4th grade to show a teacher a more efficient way to solve a problem, only to be accused of cheating and sent to the principal's office. The humiliation had taught him that sometimes being right was more dangerous than being wrong, that exceptional ability from an unexpected source was often met with suspicion rather than celebration. The nights were the hardest, when the weight of living a double life pressed down on him like a physical force. Marcus would lie in his narrow bed in the apartment he shared with his grandmother, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. Sirens, shouting, the occasional gunshot that made Ruby whisper prayers under her breath. He would stare at the water stain on their ceiling that looked like a map of some distant country and wonder if his mathematical abilities were a gift or a curse. What good was being able to solve complex equations When you couldn't solve the problem of having enough money for groceries, what was the point of understanding the elegant language of numbers when the people around you only spoke the harsh dialect of survival? Sometimes he felt like a visitor from another planet, possessing knowledge that had no practical application in his daily reality. Ruby had noticed the change in her grandson over the past few years, the way his eyes would go distant during dinner, as if he were calculating something far more complex than their monthly budget. She had seen him reading books that she couldn't even pronounce the titles of, working through problems that looked more like hieroglyphics than homework. When she asked him about it, he would deflect with a smile and a hug, not wanting to burden her with the complexity of his inner world. Ruby worked 2 jobs just to keep them afloat. Cleaning offices late into the night after her hospital shift, her hands cracked and raw from industrial disinfectants. The last thing Marcus wanted was for her to worry about his struggles with feeling different, with being exceptional in a world that had no patience for exceptional poor kids. There had been one moment, though, when his secret had almost been revealed. It was during a parent-teacher conference last spring when Mrs. Henderson had told Ruby that Marcus was falling behind and might need to repeat 6th grade. Ruby had come home that night with tears in her eyes, blaming herself for working too much, for not being able to provide the kind of educational support that other parents gave their children. Marcus had found her at the kitchen table with his report card, her weathered hands shaking as she tried to figure out how to help him succeed. That night, he had come closer than ever to telling her the truth, that he wasn't struggling academically, that he was actually years ahead of his classmates, that the problem wasn't his ability, but the system's inability to see past his circumstances. But he had looked at her exhausted face and chosen silence instead, not wanting to add confusion to her already overwhelming burden. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his memories like a knife. "Well, Marcus, are we going to stand here all day, or are you going to admit that you're in over your head?" Her tone carried the satisfaction of someone who had never been proven wrong, who had built her identity around being the smartest person in any room. The other students giggled nervously, sensing the cruelty in her words, but not yet understanding that they were witnessing something much larger than a simple math problem. Marcus felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to the library 3 years ago, the same determination that had made him teach himself advanced mathematics while his classmates struggled with multiplication tables. This wasn't just about solving an equation anymore. This was about every assumption that had ever been made about him, every limitation that had been placed on his potential, every time someone had looked at his circumstances and decided his destiny. The equation on the board seemed to pulse with possibility, each variable and coefficient calling out to him like notes in a symphony only he could hear. Marcus had solved problems far more complex than this in the quiet hours after his grandmother fell asleep, working by lamplight with scratch paper he saved from school. He had proven theorems that would challenge college students, developed shortcuts that could revolutionize how certain types of problems were approached. But none of that mattered in this moment, standing in front of a classroom full of kids who had never had to choose between buying lunch and buying notebook paper. What mattered was the choice he faced right now: continue hiding his light under the bushel basket of low expectations, or finally let it shine regardless of the consequences. Behind him, he could hear Tommy Martinez whispering to Jennifer Walsh about how this was going to be even better than the time Marcus had tripped during lunch and spilled his free meal all over the cafeteria floor. He could sense Mrs. Henderson's growing impatience, her fingers drumming against her arm as she waited for his inevitable failure. But Marcus wasn't thinking about their expectations anymore. He was thinking about his grandmother's hands, cracked and bleeding from her work but still gentle when she helped him with his homework. He was thinking about Mrs. Foster, who had believed in his potential when no one else would. He was thinking about all the brilliant minds throughout history who had faced impossible odds and chosen to solve the problems anyway. The chalk in his hand no longer felt fragile. It felt like a tool capable of changing everything, a key that could unlock doors he had never dared to approach. The classroom held its breath as Marcus finally moved, his hand rising toward the blackboard with a confidence that surprised even him. Mrs. Henderson's smirk faltered slightly as she registered something different in his posture, a certainty that hadn't been there moments before. But she quickly dismissed it, already preparing her next humiliation, already composing the story she would tell other teachers about the poor kid who thought he could solve high school math. What she didn't know What none of them knew was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just about to solve the equation on the board. He was about to solve the much more complex problem of how a brilliant mind trapped in unfortunate circumstances could finally break free from the limitations others had placed upon it. For the first time in years, Marcus smiled as he approached the blackboard, and it wasn't the careful, apologetic smile he usually wore in school. It was the smile of someone who had been holding back for so long that the release felt like liberation. He raised the chalk to the board, and in that moment, everything changed. Not just for him, but for every person in that room who was about to witness what happens when genius finally refuses to hide. The chalk touched the blackboard with a soft scratch that seemed to echo through the silent classroom like thunder. Marcus began to write, his hand moving with the fluid confidence of someone who had solved this type of problem countless times before. The first step appeared on the board in clean, precise handwriting that shocked his classmates. They had never seen him write anything longer than his name without struggling. Mrs. Henderson's smirk began to fade as she watched him factor out the common terms with mathematical elegance, each step building logically toward a solution she had assumed was beyond his comprehension. The equation that had seemed impossibly complex moments before was transforming under Marcus's guidance, revealing its hidden simplicity like a magic trick performed in reverse. His movements were deliberate and assured, the work of someone who understood not just the mechanics of mathematics, but its underlying beauty and logic. "Wait, stop," Mrs. Henderson commanded, her voice sharp with confusion and something that might have been panic. She stepped closer to the board, squinting at his work as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Marcus paused, chalk still poised in his hand, and turned to face her with an expression of polite inquiry that barely concealed his growing confidence. The classroom had fallen into the kind of absolute silence that only occurs when something unprecedented is happening, when the established order of things is being challenged in real time. Tommy Martinez had stopped his whispering. Jennifer Walsh had forgotten to finish passing her note, and even the class clown, Derek Johnson, was staring at the board with his mouth slightly open. Mrs. Henderson examined Marcus's work line by line, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The solution was correct. Not just correct, but elegant in its simplicity, showcasing shortcuts and methods that Mrs. Henderson herself wouldn't have thought to use. Marcus had approached the problem from an angle that revealed his deep understanding of mathematical principles, employing techniques that were typically taught in advanced high school courses. His factoring was flawless, his substitution method was inspired, and his final simplification was the work of someone who didn't just know the rules of mathematics, but understood their deeper purpose. Mrs. Henderson found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that this poor kid from the wrong side of Detroit had just demonstrated mathematical ability that exceeded her own. The equation she had chosen specifically because she thought it would be impossible for any sixth grader was yielding to Marcus's understanding, like ice melting under summer sun. Where did you learn to do this?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, Mrs. Henderson sounded uncertain. Her carefully constructed authority was cracking like old paint, revealing the insecurity underneath. Marcus looked at her steadily, understanding that this moment was bigger than just solving a math problem. This was about every assumption she had made about him, every time she had dismissed his potential based on his appearance and circumstances. He thought about all the nights he had spent in the library with Mrs. Foster, all the hours he had invested in teaching himself concepts that his school would never offer him. He thought about his grandmother's sacrifices and her unwavering belief that education was the key to a better life, even when she couldn't help him with his homework anymore. "I taught myself," Marcus said simply, his voice steady and clear. The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the room to confront their own assumptions about intelligence, poverty, and potential. Several students gasped audibly, unable to process the idea that someone could master such complex mathematics without formal instruction. Mrs. Henderson's face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, embarrassment, and then a flash of something that looked like anger. She had built her teaching philosophy around the belief that students needed her guidance to succeed, that knowledge was something that could only be transmitted from qualified adults to receptive children. Marcus's self-directed learning challenged everything she thought she knew about education, and intellectual development. The revelation sent ripples through the classroom dynamics that had been established since the beginning of the school year. Sarah Chen, who had always been considered the smartest student in class, stared at Marcus with a mixture of awe and confusion. She had struggled with basic algebra concepts, relying on expensive tutoring sessions that her parents arranged to keep her at the top of the class. Meanwhile, Marcus had been teaching himself advanced mathematics in his spare time, using library books and pure determination. The other students began to whisper among themselves, their perceptions shifting in real time, as they tried to reconcile the Marcus they thought they knew with the mathematical genius standing at the front of the classroom. Some looked embarrassed about their previous treatment of him, while others seemed almost angry that he had hidden his abilities for so long. Mrs. Henderson was facing a crisis that went beyond simple classroom management. Her entire worldview was being challenged by a 12-year-old boy, whose clothes she had silently judged and whose potential she had dismissed without investigation. She had spent years convincing herself that academic success was correlated with socioeconomic status, that students from poor families lacked the resources and support necessary for intellectual achievement. Marcus's demonstration of mathematical brilliance forced her to confront the possibility that she had been wrong about many things, that her prejudices had blinded her to the potential sitting right in front of her every day. The equation on the board stood as irrefutable evidence that exceptional minds can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, nurtured by internal drive rather than external privilege. "Finish it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The command came out more like a plea, as if she needed to see the complete solution to believe what was happening. Marcus nodded and turned back to the board, his hand moving with renewed confidence as he worked through the final steps. Each calculation flowed seamlessly into the next, revealing the elegant logic that connected seemingly unrelated mathematical concepts. His handwriting remained neat and precise, a stark contrast to the chicken scratch that typically covered the board during math lessons. The final answer appeared on the board like a mathematical period at the end of a beautifully constructed sentence, simple and undeniable in its correctness. The classroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and confused chatter as students tried to process what they had just witnessed. Jennifer Walsh, who had never spoken to Marcus beyond borrowing a pencil, leaned forward in her seat with undisguised amazement. Tommy Martinez, who had spent months making jokes about Marcus's second-hand clothes, suddenly looked ashamed of his previous behavior. Even Derek Johnson, notorious for his disruptive classroom antics, was staring at the board with genuine respect. The social hierarchy that had governed their classroom for the entire school year was crumbling in real time, replaced by a new understanding of who Marcus Thompson really was. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen beside the board, staring at the solution as if it might disappear if she looked away. The school's principal, Dr. Williams, appeared in the doorway at that moment, drawn by the unusual commotion coming from what was typically one of the quieter classrooms. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who had dedicated his career to urban education, fighting to provide quality learning opportunities for students who often faced significant challenges outside of school. Dr. Williams took in the scene quickly, the equation on the board, Marcus standing beside it with chalk in his hand, Mrs. Henderson's stunned expression, and the excited chatter of students who had just witnessed something extraordinary. His experienced eye immediately recognized the significance of what he was seeing, and his face broke into a smile that suggested he had been waiting for a moment like this for a very long time. "What do we have here?" Dr. Williams asked, stepping into the classroom with the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. His voice carried warmth and curiosity rather than concern, suggesting that he viewed the disruption as potentially positive rather than problematic. Mrs. Henderson struggled to find words, still processing the revelation that had just unfolded in her classroom. Marcus remained at the board, uncertain whether he was in trouble or being celebrated, his previous confidence beginning to waver under the weight of adult attention. The students fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen, that this moment might be remembered as the day everything changed for their quiet classmate, who had just revealed himself to be extraordinary. Dr. Williams approached the blackboard and examined Marcus's work with the careful attention of someone who understood advanced mathematics. His eyebrows rose progressively higher as he traced through each step of the solution, recognizing not just the correctness of the answer, but the sophistication of the approach. He had seen thousands of students over his 20-year career as an educator, but rarely had he encountered raw mathematical talent of this caliber, especially in a student who had been flying under the radar for so long. The solution on the board represented more than just academic ability. It revealed a mind capable of independent learning, creative problem-solving, and mathematical insight that could take Marcus anywhere he wanted to go in life, if properly nurtured and supported. "Marcus, isn't it?" Dr. Williams said, turning to face the boy with an expression of genuine admiration. Marcus nodded, still holding the piece of chalk like a talisman that had temporarily transformed his reality. The principal's smile grew wider as he gestured toward the board, where the solved equation stood as testament to Marcus's exceptional abilities. Mrs. Henderson remained silent, perhaps realizing that her role in this story was about to shift dramatically. The students watched with rapt attention, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come, the day their assumptions about intelligence and potential were permanently altered. What happened next would change not just Marcus's educational trajectory, but the entire culture of Roosevelt Elementary School. Dr. Williams was known throughout the district for his ability to recognize exceptional students and create opportunities for them to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances. He had spent his career fighting against the soft bigotry of low expectations, working to ensure that brilliant minds weren't wasted simply because they emerged from challenging environments. As he looked at Marcus Thompson standing beside his mathematical masterpiece, Dr. Williams saw not just a gifted student, but a chance to prove that excellence can bloom anywhere when given the right conditions to flourish. "Marcus, I think you and I need to have a conversation," Dr. Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of advocating for overlooked students. He gestured toward the hallway, but his tone made it clear this wasn't disciplinary. It was opportunity knocking. Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice, stammering something about classroom disruption and inappropriate behavior. But Dr. Williams silenced her with a look that could have frozen Detroit River in July. The students watched in fascination as their principal led Marcus toward the door, whispering excitedly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Sarah Chen was already pulling out her phone to text her parents about the boy who had just solved a problem that had stumped her expensive tutor. The chalk dust on Marcus's fingers felt like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed, or perhaps a miracle he had somehow performed without meaning to. The hallway conversation that followed would become the stuff of Roosevelt Elementary legend. Dr. Williams, who had spent 2 decades identifying gifted students hidden within the system, recognized immediately that he was looking at exceptional talent that had been systematically ignored. He asked Marcus about his mathematical background, his self-directed learning, and his experiences with Mrs. Foster at the library. With each revelation, Dr. Williams's expression grew more serious, not with disappointment, but with the righteous anger of an educator who had just discovered that a brilliant mind had been wasting away under his own roof. Marcus found himself opening up about his secret mathematical education, about nights spent solving problems by lamplight, while his grandmother worked late shifts, about the growing gap between his abilities and his academic opportunities. For the first time in his educational career, an adult in authority was listening to him not with skepticism, but with genuine interest and respect. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Roosevelt Elementary like wildfire. Teachers whispered in the faculty lounge about the poor kid who had embarrassed Mrs. Henderson with advanced mathematics. Students texted their parents about the classmate they had underestimated for years. Mrs. Foster received a phone call from Dr. Williams that afternoon, thanking her for nurturing Marcus's talent and asking for her help in developing an appropriate educational plan. The librarian's quiet pride was evident in her voice as she described Marcus's extraordinary mathematical journey, his hunger for knowledge, and his remarkable ability to teach himself concepts that challenged graduate students. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, hoping that someone in authority would finally recognize what she had known all along, that Marcus Thompson was a mathematical genius trapped in a system that couldn't see past his circumstances. Mrs. Henderson's world was crumbling with each passing hour. By the end of the school day, word had reached the district office about the incident in her classroom. Her principal had scheduled a meeting with her for the following morning, and the tone of his email suggested it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. Other teachers were looking at her differently, questioning her judgment and her treatment of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. She had built her reputation on being a tough teacher who didn't coddle students. But the Marcus situation was forcing everyone to examine whether her toughness had crossed the line into cruelty. The equation on her blackboard, which she hadn't had the heart to erase, stood as a testament to her failure to recognize exceptional ability when it sat in her classroom every day for an entire school year. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in Dr. Williams' office, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and uncertain about what it all meant for his future. The principal had made several phone calls while Marcus waited, speaking in hushed tones about gifted programs, advanced placement opportunities, and the need for immediate intervention to properly challenge a student of Marcus's caliber. Dr. Williams explained that the district had resources for exceptional students that Marcus had never been offered, programs that could accelerate his learning and provide him with peers who shared his intellectual curiosity. For the first time since he had started hiding his abilities, Marcus felt hope that he might be able to learn openly, to challenge himself academically without fear of ridicule or disbelief. The possibility that his mathematical genius might be viewed as an asset rather than a liability was almost too wonderful to believe. The phone call to Ruby Thompson came at 4:30 that afternoon, just as she was beginning her evening shift at the hospital. Dr. Williams' voice was warm but urgent as he explained the day's events to Marcus's grandmother, describing her grandson's extraordinary mathematical demonstration and the school's desire to provide him with appropriate educational opportunities. Ruby listened in stunned silence, gripping the phone with hands that trembled not from arthritis but from emotion. She had always known Marcus was special, had seen him working through problems that seemed impossibly complex, but she had never dared to hope that his intelligence might be officially recognized and nurtured. When Dr. Williams mentioned gifted programs and advanced mathematics courses, Ruby had to sit down in the hospital break room, overwhelmed by the realization that her grandson's future might be brighter than she had ever imagined possible. The evening news picked up the story by 6 o'clock, framing it as a heartwarming tale of hidden talent discovered in an unlikely place. The local reporter interviewed Dr. Williams about the importance of recognizing gifted students, regardless of their socioeconomic background, while carefully avoiding any mention of Mrs. Henderson's role in nearly missing Marcus's abilities entirely. The story resonated with viewers across Detroit, many of whom saw reflections of their own educational experiences in Marcus's journey. Social media exploded with comments from former students who had been underestimated by their teachers, parents who worried about their own children's potential being overlooked, and educators who pledged to look more carefully for hidden talent in their classrooms. Marcus Thompson had become more than just a gifted student. He had become a symbol of potential that persists despite circumstances. Mrs. Henderson spent that evening in her suburban home, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and wondering how she had gotten it so wrong. She thought about all the times she had dismissed Marcus's quiet intelligence, all the moments when she had chosen to see his poverty instead of his potential. The phone calls from other teachers and administrators that evening were polite but pointed, each conversation reinforcing the message that her treatment of Marcus had been inappropriate and potentially damaging. She began to realize that her behavior toward him hadn't just been unfair, it had been a form of educational malpractice that could have permanently derailed a brilliant young mind. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy coat she couldn't remove. Back at their small apartment, Marcus and his grandmother sat at their kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Ruby held the letter Dr. Williams had sent home, outlining the opportunities available to Marcus through the district's gifted and talented program. The words seemed almost too good to be true. Advanced mathematics courses, mentorship opportunities, possible scholarships for summer enrichment programs. Marcus explained his years of secret learning, his afternoons with Mrs. Foster, and his growing frustration with hiding his abilities. Ruby listened with tears streaming down her weathered face, not tears of sadness, but of pride and overwhelming joy. Her grandson, the boy she had raised with such limited resources, was being recognized as exceptional by people who understood academic talent. The transformation in Marcus's daily experience was immediate and profound. The next morning, he walked into Roosevelt Elementary to find that everything had changed. Students who had never spoken to him before approached with curiosity and respect, asking about his mathematical abilities and expressing amazement at what they had witnessed. Teachers smiled at him in the hallways, and Mrs. Foster greeted him with a hug that conveyed years of quiet pride finally being validated. Even the cafeteria workers, who had seen him count out change for his reduced-price lunch countless times, looked at him with new awareness of who he really was beneath the surface of his circumstances. The invisible boy had become visible overnight, but this time the attention felt different, respectful rather than pitying, curious rather than judgmental. Mrs. Henderson's reckoning came during her meeting with Dr. Williams the following morning. The principal's office felt smaller than usual as she sat across from him, the weight of her behavior toward Marcus heavy in the air between them. Dr. Williams spoke carefully but firmly about the school's commitment to recognizing and nurturing all students' potential, regardless of their background or appearance. He outlined the steps she would need to take to rebuild trust with her students and the broader school community, including professional development focused on recognizing giftedness in underserved populations. Mrs. Henderson accepted the consequences of her actions with whatever dignity she could muster, knowing that her reputation as an educator had been permanently altered by her failure to see Marcus's extraordinary abilities. The real confrontation, however, was the one Mrs. Henderson had with herself. Standing in her empty classroom that afternoon, looking at the equation that Marcus had solved with such elegance, she was forced to confront the biases that had shaped her teaching for years. She had prided herself on being a demanding teacher who prepared students for the real world, but she realized that her demands had been unevenly applied, her expectations shaped more by stereotypes than by genuine assessment of student potential. The Marcus situation had exposed the uncomfortable truth that she had been part of a system that wasted human talent based on superficial judgments. As she finally erased the equation from her blackboard, Mrs. Henderson made a decision that would define the rest of her teaching career. She would never again let her assumptions blind her to a student's possibilities. The story of Marcus Thompson's mathematical revelation spread beyond Detroit, inspiring educators across the country to look more carefully at the students in their own classrooms. University professors reached out to Dr. Williams, offering mentorship opportunities for Marcus and expressing interest in following his academic progress. The boy who had been invisible for years suddenly found himself at the center of conversations about educational equity, gifted education in underserved communities, and the importance of recognizing talent wherever it might appear. His grandmother framed the newspaper article about his story, hanging it next to the kitchen table where they did homework each night, a reminder that exceptional minds can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances when given the chance to flourish. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood at the front of a very different classroom, this time addressing a group of university professors and education officials who had come to witness his presentation on alternative mathematical proofs. His clothes were still second-hand, his shoes still scuffed, but now these details seemed irrelevant compared to the confidence radiating from his voice as he explained complex theoretical concepts with the fluency of someone born to teach. The advanced mathematics program at Roosevelt Elementary had been restructured around students like Marcus, with Dr. Williams securing funding for gifted education initiatives that served the entire district. Mrs. Foster sat in the back row, her proud smile visible even from across the room, watching the boy she had mentored in secret finally receiving the recognition he deserved. The equation that had started it all was framed on the wall behind him, not as a symbol of humiliation, but as a testament to the power of hidden potential finally revealed. Ruby Thompson watched from the audience as her grandson fielded questions from mathematics professors who spoke to him as an intellectual equal, their respect evident in every exchange. She had taken time off from her hospital shift to attend this presentation, wearing her best dress and sitting with the other family members who had come to support their exceptional children. The transformation in Marcus had been remarkable not just academically but personally. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer had to hide his intelligence, who had found his place in a world that finally valued his mind over his circumstances. Ruby thought about all the nights she had worked double shifts to keep them afloat, never knowing that her grandson was teaching himself advanced mathematics by lamplight, building a foundation that would eventually lift them both toward a brighter future than she had ever dared to imagine. The ripple effects of Marcus's story had transformed Roosevelt Elementary into a model for identifying and nurturing gifted students from all backgrounds. Dr. Williams had implemented new assessment protocols that looked beyond traditional indicators of academic promise, training teachers to recognize exceptional ability, even when it came wrapped in poverty or cultural differences. The school's test scores had improved dramatically as educators learned to see potential rather than limitations, to challenge students rather than dismiss them based on superficial judgments. Mrs. Henderson, who had completed extensive professional development on bias in education, now served as a cautionary tale and advocate for change, speaking at conferences about the importance of examining one's assumptions about student capabilities. Her journey from skeptic to supporter had been painful but transformative, forcing her to confront the ways her biases had affected countless students over her career. The university scholarship offers had started arriving in March, each one representing opportunities that would have been unimaginable just months before. Marcus's mathematical abilities had caught the attention of prestigious institutions across the country, all eager to nurture a talent that had been discovered almost by accident in an inner-city elementary school. The boy who had once hidden his intelligence now found himself choosing between full scholarships to programs designed for the most gifted young mathematicians in the nation. Dr. Williams had helped coordinate meetings with admissions counselors and academic advisors, ensuring that Marcus understood not just the opportunities available to him, but also the responsibility that came with such exceptional ability. The conversation had shifted from whether Marcus belonged in advanced programs to which programs were worthy of his remarkable mind. The friendship that had developed between Marcus and his former classmates represented one of the most heartwarming aspects of his transformation. Students who had once ignored or dismissed him now sought him out for help with their own mathematics homework, treating him not as a curiosity, but as a valued member of their academic community. Sarah Chen, who had initially felt threatened by Marcus's abilities, had become one of his closest friends, learning from him while helping him navigate the social dynamics of his newfound recognition. Tommy Martinez had apologized publicly for his previous behavior, becoming an advocate for treating all students with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The classroom dynamics that had once reflected broader social inequalities had evolved into a more inclusive environment where intelligence was celebrated regardless of its source. Mrs. Foster had been promoted to head of the district's library services, tasked with developing programs to identify and support self-directed learners like Marcus throughout the school system. Her quiet mentorship had become a model for how librarians could serve as academic talent scouts, creating safe spaces for exceptional students to explore their interests without fear of judgment or limitation. She had established after-school programs for advanced learners, connecting them with resources and mentors who could guide their intellectual development. The relationship she had built with Marcus had demonstrated the profound impact that one caring adult could have on a child's trajectory, inspiring other educators to look more carefully for students who might be struggling, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked appropriate challenges. The evening news story that had made Marcus locally famous had evolved into a documentary about educational equity and the importance of recognizing giftedness in all its forms. Filmmakers had followed his journey from that pivotal day in Mrs. Henderson's classroom through his acceptance into advanced programs, capturing the transformation not just of one student, but of an entire educational community. The documentary would eventually be used in teacher training programs across the country, helping educators understand the consequences of low expectations and the power of believing in student potential. Marcus's story had become larger than his individual experience, representing the countless exceptional minds that go unrecognized because they don't fit traditional molds of academic success. The most profound change, however, was in Marcus himself. The boy who had once made himself invisible in classrooms now embraced his role as a mathematical prodigy with grace and humility that impressed everyone who met him. He understood that his abilities came with responsibilities, to his grandmother, who had sacrificed for his education, to Mrs. Foster, who had believed in him when no one else would, to the younger students who now looked up to him as proof that genius could emerge from anywhere. His success had opened doors not just for him, but for other students from similar backgrounds, creating pathways for exceptional minds that might otherwise remain hidden. The weight of representation sat lightly on his shoulders, carried with the same natural confidence he brought to solving complex equations. The transformation of Mrs. Henderson's teaching practice had become equally remarkable in its own way. Her experience with Marcus had forced her to examine every assumption she had made about student potential throughout her career, leading to a complete overhaul of her classroom approach. She now actively sought out quiet students who might be hiding exceptional abilities, creating environments where all forms of intelligence could be expressed and celebrated. Her professional development presentations had become some of the most requested in the district, as she shared her journey from bias to advocacy with an honesty that was both painful and inspiring. The teacher who had once dismissed Marcus's potential had become one of his strongest supporters, attending his presentations and celebrating his achievements with the fervor of someone who truly understood the magnitude of what had almost been lost. As Marcus concluded his presentation that day, fielding the final questions from impressed professors and education officials, he caught sight of his grandmother in the audience, her face glowing with pride and tears of joy. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that humiliating day when Mrs. Henderson had tried to break his spirit to this triumphant afternoon when his mathematical genius was being celebrated by some of the brightest minds in academia. The equation on the wall behind him served as a reminder that sometimes the most important problems we solve aren't mathematical at all, but human ones, the problem of seeing potential where others see limitation, of believing in excellence regardless of its packaging, of refusing to let circumstances define destiny. The scholarship decision had been easier than anyone expected. Marcus chose the program that offered not just academic excellence, but also opportunities to give back to communities like the one that had raised him. His goal was to become not just a mathematician, but an educator, someone who could identify and nurture the next generation of hidden talents waiting to be discovered in classrooms across America. He wanted to ensure that no other brilliant child would have to hide their abilities the way he had, that exceptional minds would be recognized and celebrated regardless of their circumstances. The boy who had been told he couldn't even read was now planning to revolutionize how society identifies and develops mathematical genius in underserved communities. Dr. Williams announced that Roosevelt Elementary would be establishing the Marcus Thompson Mathematics Excellence Program, designed to identify and support gifted students from all backgrounds. The program would provide advanced coursework, mentorship opportunities, and resources for families who might not otherwise have access to enrichment programs. Marcus had insisted that the program include training for teachers on recognizing bias and developing inclusive practices that supported all forms of excellence. His name would be associated not just with mathematical achievement, but with educational equity, ensuring that future generations of exceptional students would have opportunities he had almost missed. The invisible boy had become a beacon of hope for countless others who were still waiting to be seen. The final moment of that remarkable day came when Mrs. Henderson approached Marcus after his presentation, her eyes filled with tears of regret and admiration. She apologized once again for her treatment of him, but Marcus responded with the grace that had characterized his entire transformation. He thanked her for the lesson she had unknowingly taught him, that believing in yourself is sometimes more important than having others believe in you, that exceptional ability will eventually reveal itself, no matter how many obstacles are placed in its path. Their reconciliation represented more than just personal healing. It symbolized the possibility that education could evolve, that minds could change, that exceptional students could be recognized and celebrated regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. As families gathered their belongings and professors exchanged contact information with Marcus about future collaborations, Ruby Thompson took her grandson's hand and squeezed it gently. They walked out of Roosevelt Elementary together, past the trophy case that now included Marcus's mathematics competition awards, past the hallway where his story had first unfolded, toward a future bright with possibilities that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. The boy who had once hidden his light under a bushel of low expectations was now illuminating pathways for others to follow. proving that brilliance can emerge from the most unlikely places when given the chance to shine. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that exceptional minds exist everywhere, waiting for the right moment to reveal their extraordinary gifts to a world that's finally ready to see them.